You ever notice how the loudest person in the room is usually the one no one actually hears? The chair scraped sharply against the hardwood floor, the sound cutting through the soft clinking of glasses and low conversations like a blade through silk, and then came the laughter, too loud, too forced, echoing under the warm amber lights of the upscale Manhattan restaurant where every plate cost more than a week's groceries and every guest knew better than to draw attention, except Lucas Hale didn't care, not tonight, not anymore. His tailored jacket half slipping off one shoulder as he leaned back, spinning a glass between his fingers like the world owed him entertainment, while waiters froze mid-step and a couple at the next table exchanged a glance before quietly reaching for their coats, because everyone in that room knew exactly who he was, the son of Daniel Hale, a man whose name alone could buy silence, and silence was exactly what filled the space now, thick and suffocating. As if the air itself had decided to step back and watch, but not Naomi Carter. She stood near the edge of the dining floor with a tray balanced in one hand, her posture straight despite the long hours behind her, despite the ache in her feet that had started somewhere around hour 8 of her double shift, her eyes steady, not on the mess, not on the spilled drinks slowly dripping off the edge of the table, but on him, really on him, the way no one else dared to be, and for a moment she didn't move, not because she was afraid, but because she was choosing, weighing something invisible against everything she had learned about keeping her head down, about surviving in places where people like her were expected to disappear, and then, without asking permission, without looking to the manager who had already started signaling for someone else to handle it, Naomi stepped forward, her shoes quiet against the polished floor, the kind of quiet that doesn't beg for attention but somehow takes it anyway. And when she reached his table, she didn't reach for a towel, didn't call security, didn't even acknowledge the tension hanging in the air like a hell breath. Instead she set the tray aside, pulled out the chair across from him, and sat down, just sat, like the chaos didn't belong to him alone anymore, like it was something that could be shared, understood, maybe even softened, and for the first time since he walked in, Lucas paused, the movement in his hand stopping mid-spin, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to figure out whether this was defiance or something else entirely, something unfamiliar, something that didn't fit into the usual script of fear or irritation or forced politeness. And Naomi met his gaze without flinching, her voice calm, low, steady enough to cut through everything else without needing to be loud, and in that suspended second where the entire room seemed to lean in without meaning to, she spoke, not to the noise he created, not to the reputation that followed him, but to the part of him no one else had bothered to see. "You don't have to do this." And just like that, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that the silence changed shape, enough that the chaos no longer felt like control, but like something cracking open from the inside. Lucas did not laugh this time, the sound that had filled the room moments ago fading into something smaller, something uncertain, as his fingers slowly loosened around the glass and he set it down with a quiet clink that somehow carried farther than the chaos before it, and for a second he just stared at Naomi like she had spoken a language he almost understood but could not quite place, his jaw tightening slightly, not in anger, but in hesitation, as if he had been handed a mirror he did not ask for, and around them the restaurant remained frozen in that delicate balance between attention and avoidance, forks hovering, whispers swallowed before they could form, while a server near the back pretended to adjust a table setting that did not need adjusting, anything to stay busy, anything to not look too closely at what was happening in the center of the room, but Naomi did not move. Her hands resting lightly on the table, steady, grounded, her breathing even as if the weight of the moment did not belong to her alone, and in truth it did not. She had seen this before, not in rooms like this with polished marble and soft jazz humming through hidden speakers, but in smaller places, louder places, places where people carried their pain in ways that made others step back instead of lean in, and she had learned early that sometimes the loudest actions were just quiet cries wrapped in pride, and Lucas shifted in his chair, the confidence that had filled his posture now slipping into something less certain, his eyes flicking briefly toward the surrounding tables before returning to her, searching, calculating, and then finally landing somewhere closer to honest than anything he had shown since he walked in. "You do not know anything about me," he said, his voice lower now, still edged, but no longer performing for the room, and Naomi nodded slightly, not disagreeing, not challenging, just acknowledging the truth of that statement without stepping away from what she had already said. "You are right," she replied softly, her tone carrying no trace of judgment. "I do not know your story." And the words settled between them, simple, unforced, creating space instead of closing it, and for a moment Lucas looked almost relieved by that, like. The absence of accusation was more disarming than any confrontation could have been, his shoulders dropping just a fraction as he exhaled, a breath he had not realized he was holding, and the tension in the room shifted again, subtle but undeniable, as if something invisible had been loosened, and Naomi reached for the glass of water she had set down earlier, sliding it gently across the table toward him, the movement small, deliberate, her fingers brushing the cool surface before she let go. And he watched it like it was something unfamiliar, something not meant for him, before finally wrapping his hand around it, the condensation damp against his palm, grounding, real, and he did not drink right away, just held it there, his gaze lowering for the first time, not to avoid her, but to think, to feel, to sit in a silence that was no longer filled with expectation. And somewhere near the entrance a couple quietly returned to their seats, sensing the shift without understanding it. While the manager, who had been hovering near the edge of the room, slowly lowered his hand, no longer signaling for intervention, because whatever was happening here was not chaos anymore, it was something else, something fragile, something that could not be rushed, and Naomi remained where she was, present but not intrusive, her eyes soft, her posture open, offering nothing more than attention, the kind that asked for nothing in return. And Lucas finally lifted the glass, taking a slow sip, the motion almost careful, as if he was relearning something basic, something he had forgotten in all the noise, and when he set it back down, his voice came quieter than before, stripped of the sharp edges that had once filled it. "Then why would you say that?" he asked, not accusing, but genuinely unsure, and Naomi tilted her head just slightly, considering him for a brief moment before answering, her voice steady, certain in a way that did not need to be loud. "Because I have seen what it looks like when someone is trying to be heard, and no one is listening." And this time when the words landed, they did not bounce off, they stayed, settling somewhere deeper, somewhere Lucas could not ignore even if he wanted to, and the silence that followed was no longer empty, it was full, heavy with something real beginning to take shape. Lucas did not respond right away, the question he had asked still lingering in the air like something unfinished. But now it was his turn to sit inside the silence, not escape it, not fill it with noise, just feel it, and for the first time that night, he did not look around to see who was watching, he did not check the room for reactions or approval, his attention stayed fixed on the table, on the faint reflection of the overhead lights in the glass. As if he was trying to recognize himself in something steady, something honest, and his fingers traced the edge of the rim slowly, absent-minded, grounding himself in the smallest movement he could control, while across from him Naomi remained still, her presence quiet but unwavering, not pushing, not pulling, just there, and the restaurant, once tense and rigid, began to breathe again in subtle ways, a fork placed down gently, a quiet sip of water, the soft return of background music that had never stopped but somehow felt new. Like the room itself was adjusting to a different kind of moment, and Lucas leaned back slightly in his chair, his shoulders no longer squared with defiance but settling into something heavier, something more real, his voice when it came softer, almost careful. "People always listen," he said, but there was no conviction in it, only habit, a line repeated too many times to still feel true, and Naomi tilted her head just a fraction, her eyes never leaving his, not challenging him, but inviting him to hear himself. And he exhaled slowly, the faintest shake of his head following as if even he did not believe what he had just said. "No," he corrected quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop it, and that was when it shifted again, not in the room, not in the space around them, but inside him, a realization that did not come with noise or drama, just a quiet, undeniable clarity, and he let out a breath that seemed to carry more weight than it should have, his gaze dropping again. But this time not to avoid, but to remember. "They listen to what I do," he said, his voice low, steady. They listen to my last name, to what they think I am supposed to be. And his jaw tightened slightly, not with anger, but with something closer to frustration, something long held. But they do not hear me. And the word settled. Between them, heavier now, more honest than anything that had come before, and Naomi nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging something important had just been placed on the table, something fragile, something real, and she did not rush to respond, did not fill the space with reassurance or advice. She let it sit, let it exist, because sometimes being heard started with simply not being interrupted. And Lucas leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table, his posture no longer guarded but open in a way that felt unfamiliar even to him, and for a moment he glanced up, meeting her eyes again, not searching this time, but asking without words if it was safe to continue, and when he saw no judgment there, no impatience, just quiet attention, something inside him loosened further. My father built everything on control, he said slowly, choosing each word as if it mattered. Every deal, every move, every decision, it is always about being the one in charge. And he paused. The faintest flicker of something crossing his face, not resentment, not exactly, but something unresolved, something that had never been given space to exist. And I guess I learned that if I was not the one making the noise, I would just disappear. And there it was, the truth beneath the chaos, simple, unpolished, but undeniable, and Naomi listened, really listened, her expression soft but attentive, absorbing not just the words but the weight behind them, and outside the large windows the city lights reflected faintly against the glass, distant traffic moving in steady lines, life continuing beyond this quiet moment that felt strangely separate from everything else. And for the first time that night, Lucas did not look like someone trying to be seen. He looked like someone finally allowing himself to be understood, even if he did not fully know how yet. Naomi did not interrupt him, did not rush to soften what he had just revealed, because she understood that some truths needed space to breathe before they could be understood, and for a moment she simply watched him, really watched him, not the tailored suit, not the name that carried weight in every corner of the city, but the way his shoulders curved slightly forward now, the way his hands no longer performed but rested, uncertain, as if he was no longer sure what role he was supposed to play, and the quiet between them stretched, not empty, but full, like the pause before something meaningful finds its place. And Naomi finally leaned in just a fraction, her voice calm, steady, grounded in something deeper than opinion. That sounds exhausting, she said softly, and the words did not accuse, did not pity, they simply acknowledged, and Lucas blinked once, caught off guard not by the statement itself, but by the absence of expectation behind it, as if she was not asking him to be anything other than what he already was in that moment, and he let out a breath that almost sounded like a quiet laugh, but without humor, more like relief slipping through a crack he did not know he had. Yeah, he admitted, his voice low. It is. And he leaned back slightly, his eyes drifting toward the window where the city lights flickered in reflections that felt distant, almost unreal. You spend so much time trying to be something, that you forget what you actually feel like, he added, his tone thoughtful now, less guarded, and Naomi nodded slowly, her gaze steady, not rushing to respond, because she knew this part mattered, the part where someone hears their own words and begins to recognize them as truth, and a soft clink echoed somewhere in the background as a glass was set down at another table, the restaurant slowly returning to its rhythm, but the space around them remained its own world, separate, quieter, and Naomi reached for the edge of the table lightly, grounding herself before she spoke again. You do not have to prove anything right now, she said, her voice gentle but certain, and Lucas glanced back at her, something in his expression shifting again, not resistance, but confusion, as if the idea itself did not quite make sense to him. Then what am I supposed to do? He asked, not defensively, but honestly, the question carrying more weight than the words alone suggested, and Naomi held his gaze for a moment before answering, choosing her words carefully, not because they needed to be perfect, but because they needed to be real. You can just be here, she said, and there was no complexity in it, no hidden meaning, just a simple invitation. And for a second Lucas looked like he might argue, like his mind was searching for something more structured, something with rules or expectations. But then he stopped, the tension in his brow easing slightly as if he was letting go of that need, and he exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping just a little more, and the change was subtle, almost invisible to anyone not paying close attention, but it was there, a shift from performing to existing, and Naomi noticed it. Not with surprise, but with quiet recognition, and she leaned back in her chair just slightly, giving him space within the moment rather than crowding it, and around them the restaurant continued its gentle return to normal, conversations picking up in hushed tones, silverware moving again, but none of it intruded on what had formed between them, and Lucas reached for the glass of water again, taking another sip, slower this time, as if he was paying attention to the act itself. And when he set it down, his hand lingered there for a moment, his fingers resting against the cool surface, grounding him in something simple, something real, and for the first time since he had walked into that room, he did not look like he was trying to control the space around him. He looked like he was finally allowing himself to feel what was already there, and Naomi watched quietly, not expecting anything more, because she knew that sometimes the most powerful change did not come with a grand gesture, but with a quiet decision to stop running from what had been there all along. The moment stretched longer than either of them expected, not awkward, not forced, just unfamiliar in a way that made everything feel sharper, clearer. As if the noise that once filled Lucas's mind had been turned down enough for him to finally hear something underneath it, and he shifted slightly in his seat, his posture no longer rigid, no longer carrying that invisible weight of expectation, but not entirely relaxed either, like someone learning how to stand still after running for too long, and Naomi noticed it, the way his eyes moved now, slower, more intentional, taking in the details around him instead of pushing against them, the soft glow of the overhead lights reflecting off the polished table, the faint hum of conversation returning in careful waves, the quiet rhythm of a place that had almost been disrupted but was now finding its balance again, and she allowed herself a small breath, steady and measured, because moments like this were delicate, not something to rush or reshape, and Lucas glanced at her again, his expression different now, not guarded, not performative, but searching in a quieter way. "Do you ever get tired of it?" he asked suddenly, his voice low, as if the question had been sitting somewhere in his mind waiting for the right moment to surface, and Naomi tilted her head slightly, not confused, but considering. "Of what?" she asked gently, and he gestured vaguely, not toward anything specific, but toward everything at once, the room, the roles, the unspoken expectations that filled spaces like this. "Of being the one who has to understand everyone else," he clarified, and there was something almost vulnerable in the way he said it, like he was asking not just out of curiosity, but out of a quiet hope that someone might understand him in return. And Naomi let the question settle for a moment before answering, her gaze steady, her tone thoughtful. "Sometimes," she admitted, her honesty simple, unguarded. "But I do not see it as something I have to do," she continued, her voice calm. "I see it as something I choose to do." And Lucas frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in concentration, trying to grasp the difference, and she leaned in just a little, not closing the space, just enough to make the words feel closer, more real. "There is a difference between carrying something because you feel forced to, and carrying something because you know it matters," she said, and the words did not come as advice, but as a quiet offering, and Lucas looked down again, his fingers brushing lightly against the surface of the table, tracing an invisible line as he processed what she had said, and something in his expression shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to show that the idea had landed somewhere deeper than the surface. "I do not think I have ever had that choice," he said after a moment, his voice softer now, more reflective, and Naomi watched him carefully, not interrupting, because she could feel that he was getting closer to something important, something he had not said out loud before, and he let out a slow breath, his shoulders rising and falling as if releasing something heavy. "It has always been decided for me," he added, almost to himself, and the words lingered, not bitter, not angry, just honest in a way that did not need decoration, and Naomi nodded once, her expression understanding without needing to say it, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence settling in again, But this time it felt different, fuller, like something had shifted into place, and Lucas leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting toward the window again. But this time he did not look distant, he looked present, like he was finally inside the moment instead of outside of it, and Naomi slowly pushed her chair back just a fraction, not leaving, just creating space, allowing the moment to breathe on its own. Because she understood that this was the part where change did not need to be guided, it only needed to be allowed, and as Lucas sat there, quieter now, grounded in something he was only beginning to understand, the room around them continued to move, but he no longer needed to control it, and for the first time that night, the silence did not feel like something to escape, it felt like something he could stay in without losing himself. The city outside had begun to soften into night, the glow of streetlights stretching across the glass, like quiet reflections of a world still moving, still rushing, while inside the restaurant the pace had slowed into something almost gentle, conversations returning in low tones, cutlery moving with care, as if everyone sensed that something important had unfolded and no one wanted to disturb it, and Lucas remained seated, his posture no longer tense, no longer performing, but still, grounded. Like he had finally found a place where he did not have to fill the space just to prove he belonged in it, and his eyes lingered on the table for a moment longer before lifting again, this time not searching for control, but for understanding, and Naomi, who had given him that space without asking for anything in return, began to shift slightly in her chair, not to leave abruptly, but to return to the rhythm of her work, because she knew this moment was not meant to be held too tightly. It was meant to be lived and then allowed to continue on its own, and she reached for her tray with quiet precision, her movements smooth, practiced, but there was a softness to them now, a quiet acknowledgement of what had just passed between them, and Lucas noticed it immediately, the subtle signal that the moment was changing, not ending, just moving forward, and something in him hesitated, not out of fear, but out of a quiet realization that he did not want to lose what he had just found, even if he did not fully understand it yet. "Wait," he said, his voice not loud, but clear enough to stop her gently, and Naomi paused, turning back toward him with the same calm presence she had held all along, her expression open, not expecting anything, not assuming anything, just present, and Lucas took a breath, deeper this time, as if he was stepping into unfamiliar territory without the need to pretend he already knew the way. "What you said about choosing," he began, his words slower now, more deliberate. "How do you do that?" And there was no pride in the question, no edge, just genuine curiosity, the kind that only comes when someone is ready to hear an answer, and Naomi considered him for a moment, not rushing to respond, because she understood that this question was not simple, it was not something that could be solved in a single sentence, but it could be felt, and she set the tray back down gently, her attention returning fully to him. "You start small," she said, her voice steady. "You choose how you show up in moments like this." And she gestured lightly around them, not drawing attention, just acknowledging the space. "Not because it changes everything right away, but because it changes you." And Lucas listened, really listened, his focus no longer scattered, no longer defensive, but present, absorbing the words not as instructions, but as something to consider, something to carry, and Naomi continued, her tone calm, grounded in experience rather than theory. "You do not need to control everything to matter," she added, and the simplicity of it settled into the space between them, quiet but powerful, and Lucas let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing just a little more, as if something inside him was beginning to realign, not completely, not all at once, but enough to feel the difference, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence returning, but this time it felt different again, lighter, more open, like a door that had been closed for too long was finally cracked open, and Naomi picked up her tray once more, this time without hesitation, her role calling her back, the world continuing as it always did, but Lucas remained where he was, his gaze following her for just a second longer, not because he needed her to stay, but because he understood now that what she had given him was not something that stayed in one place, it was something he could carry forward, something he could choose. And as she moved away into the soft rhythm of the restaurant, blending back into the flow she had always been part of, Lucas sat quietly, no longer trying to fill the silence, no longer needing to prove anything to anyone in the room, and for the first time in a long time, he did not feel like he was disappearing in the quiet. He felt like he was finally beginning to understand himself within it. Lucas did not move for a while after Naomi stepped away, his eyes following her only briefly before settling back onto the table in front of him. But this time the stillness around him felt different, not empty, not something to escape, but something he could sit inside without feeling like he was losing control, and the faint hum of the restaurant returned fully now, conversations flowing again, glasses clinking softly, a quiet rhythm that no longer felt distant but present, like he was finally part of it instead of standing outside of it, and he reached for the glass of water once more, his fingers wrapping around it with a steadiness that had not been there before, lifting it slowly, taking a measured sip. Not out of habit, but awareness, and when he set it down, he noticed something small but undeniable. His hands were no longer tense, no longer gripping for control, they were simply resting, and that realization lingered for a moment, subtle but powerful, as if something inside him had shifted into alignment without needing permission, and he leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting toward the entrance where people continued to come and go, each carrying their own stories, their own unseen weight. And for the first time he did not see them as background, as noise, but as individuals, separate, real, and that awareness settled into him quietly, expanding the space he occupied without making it louder, and then his eyes moved again, searching not for dominance, not for recognition, but for something else, and they found Naomi across the room, moving between tables with the same quiet precision, her presence blending into the rhythm of the place, unnoticed by most, but now impossible for him to ignore, and he watched her for a moment, not in admiration, not in curiosity, but in recognition, understanding now that what she had done was not about him alone, it was who she chose to be, consistently, regardless of who was in front of her, and something in his chest tightened slightly, not with discomfort, but with clarity, and he looked down at the table again, his fingers brushing lightly against the smooth surface as a thought began to form, not forced, not rehearsed, just real. And after a brief hesitation, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a pen he had not realized he still carried, the metal cool against his fingers, and he glanced around for a moment before spotting a small receipt left behind on the edge of the table, and he picked it up, turning it over slowly, the blank side offering just enough space, and for a second he paused, not because he did not know what to say, but because he wanted it to be honest, not something expected, not something performed, and then he began to write, his hand steady, the movement deliberate, each word forming without hesitation, and when he finished, he looked at it for a moment, reading it once, not to correct it, but to feel it, to make sure it was true, and then he folded the small piece of paper carefully, placing it at the center of the table where it would be seen, not hidden, not emphasized, just there, and he reached for his wallet, leaving enough to cover the meal, but without the exaggerated gesture that might have once defined him, and he stood up slowly, adjusting his jacket, not out of habit, but out of awareness, and as he turned toward the exit, he paused for just a second, his gaze shifting back across the room, finding Naomi again, but this time he did not call out, did not interrupt. Because he understood now that not every moment needed to be claimed, some moments were meant to be carried forward quietly, and with that, he stepped toward the door, the cool night air waiting just beyond the glass, and as he walked out into the city, the noise of the streets rising to meet him, something inside him remained steady, unchanged by the chaos around him, not because the world had softened, but because for the first time, he had learned how to be still within it. The door closed softly behind Lucas, the faint chime above it barely noticeable against the steady rhythm of the city outside, and for a moment the space he left behind seemed to hold onto his absence, like a quiet echo that had not fully faded, while inside the restaurant the evening continued to unfold, plates moving, conversations rebuilding, but something had shifted in a way that no one could quite explain, and Naomi, who had returned to her work without hesitation, moved between tables with the same calm presence she always carried. Her steps measured, her attention focused, yet somewhere beneath that steady rhythm there was a subtle awareness, a quiet sense that something meaningful had passed through the room and left its mark, and it was not until she approached the table he had occupied that she noticed it, the folded receipt resting at the center. Simple, unremarkable at first glance, but placed with intention, and she paused for just a second, her hand hovering over it before she picked it up, unfolding it carefully, not rushing, not expecting anything, just present in the moment, and her eyes moved across the words written there, steady, taking them in without reaction at first. "Thank you for seeing me." And the simplicity of it settled into her chest in a way that did not need explanation, because she understood exactly what it meant. Not as a compliment, not as gratitude in the usual sense, but as recognition, the kind that did not come easily in a world that often overlooked quiet things. And she stood there for a moment longer, the soft glow of the overhead lights reflecting off the polished table, the hum of the restaurant continuing around her, and she folded the paper again, slower this time, more deliberate, before slipping it gently into the pocket of her apron, not for display, not for validation, but because it mattered. And as she turned to continue her shift, there was no dramatic change in her expression, no visible shift in her posture, but something inside her settled into a quiet warmth, a confirmation of something she had always known but rarely had reflected back to her, that the smallest moments, the quietest choices, could reach further than anyone realized. And across the room a couple shared a quiet conversation, their voices low, their attention no longer drawn to disruption but to each other, and the manager, who had once stood ready to intervene, now simply observed from a distance, his posture relaxed, the tension gone, replaced by something closer to reflection, and Naomi moved through it all seamlessly, placing dishes, clearing tables, offering brief smiles where needed, her presence blending into the fabric of the evening, but now carrying a subtle resonance, like a note that had been struck and was still quietly echoing. And outside, the city continued its endless motion, cars passing in steady lines, lights flickering across windows, people moving with purpose, unaware of the small moment that had just unfolded inside, unaware that something had shifted not just for one person, but in a way that might ripple outward in ways no one could fully predict. And as Naomi paused briefly near the service station, adjusting her tray before stepping back onto the floor, her fingers brushed lightly against the folded paper in her pocket, a quiet reminder that being seen was not always about standing in the spotlight. Sometimes it was about standing still long enough for someone else to finally find their way back to themselves. And somewhere out in the city, beyond the glass and the light and the steady rhythm of the night, Lucas walked forward carrying something he had not walked in with, something quiet, something steady, something that would not fade. As easily as the noise he had left behind, the night settled deeper outside, the city lights stretching across the streets like quiet lines of motion that never truly stopped, and inside the restaurant the final hours of the shift unfolded with a steady rhythm, slower now, softer, as tables emptied one by one and conversations faded into low murmurs, and Naomi moved through it all with the same quiet consistency. Clearing the last plates, stacking glasses, her movements smooth and unhurried, as if she understood that endings did not need to be rushed. They simply arrived when the moment was ready, and when the last guest stepped out and the door closed gently behind them, a calm silence filled the space, not heavy, not tense, but complete, like a breath finally released after a long day. And Naomi paused near the window, her hands resting lightly against the edge of a table as she looked out at the passing lights, the reflections shifting across the glass in patterns that felt both distant and familiar. And for a moment she reached into her apron, her fingers brushing against the folded paper still tucked safely inside, and she pulled it out slowly, unfolding it once more, her eyes tracing the words again, not because she had forgotten them, but because she wanted to feel them again, to let them settle deeper. And there was no smile, no visible reaction, just a quiet stillness that carried meaning in a way words never could. And she folded it carefully once more, placing it back where it belonged, not as something to hold onto tightly, but as something to carry forward without effort. And behind her the staff moved quietly, closing down the space, chairs being lifted, lights dimming slightly, the end of the night arriving in small, ordinary actions that marked the passing of time. And Naomi turned away from the window, stepping back into that rhythm without hesitation, because this was her world, not defined by grand moments, but by the quiet consistency of showing up, again and again, with the same presence, the same intention, and somewhere out in the city, Lucas walked through the night air, the sounds of traffic and distant voices surrounding him, but no longer pressing in, no longer demanding a reaction. And his steps slowed slightly as he passed a row of darkened storefronts, the reflections in the glass catching his movement for just a second, and he paused, not out of habit, but out of awareness, his gaze meeting his own reflection, not searching, not judging, just seeing. And for the first time he did not feel the need to adjust, to correct, to perform. He simply stood there, present in a way that felt unfamiliar but steady, and after a moment he exhaled a quiet breath that carried something lighter than before, and he continued walking, not toward anything specific, but forward, carrying with him something that did not need to be explained, something that would not fade with the night. And back inside the restaurant, as the final lights dimmed and the space settled into stillness, Naomi stepped toward the door, her hand resting briefly on the handle before she turned it, the cool air meeting her as she stepped outside, and for a second she paused, looking out at the same city that never stopped moving. And in that shared space, under the same quiet sky, two lives continued forward, changed not by force, not by circumstance, but by a single moment where someone chose to see, and someone chose to be seen, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was full, carrying with it the quiet weight of something real, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood.